there's a very important component in sports, and it's called the out-of-bounds line. You guys familiar with the out-of-bounds line? We get very passionate about the out-of-bounds line, particularly when a play is hanging in the balance and a decision is having to be made of what is considered in bounds and what is considered out of bounds. There are famous athletes in history that we can think of about how passionate they might become around decisions made of what is in bounds and what's out of bounds. Maybe you might think of John McEnroe, an athlete who is known. Some of you are going, who? I know it dates me a bit. He played tennis really, really well, but he was also quite passionate and he was famous for his explosions on the court over what he would view as a contested call, because he would want the ball to either be in bounds or out of bounds according to what would give him the advantage. We are very familiar with the concept of things that are in bounds or out of bounds. In fact, we use it in colloquial phrases when someone says a bad dad joke, like, have you been using corduroy pillows? They're making all the headlines. And you just go, well, Pastor David, that is really out of bounds. Like, not funny. It's a groaner. It's out of bounds. We use this concept because we function in society with the concept of staying in bounds. We do it when we drive, mostly. There's a God-given design that we're looking at in this overarching story of the Bible. And God has established of what is in bounds. And that really is the beautiful beginning of the story of God. He creates everything. We are introduced to who He is. We see that there's an order to the creation of God. There is a specific and unique design to the created order around us, from the vastness of the universe to the microscopic complexities of the human eye or the cell. Everything is uniquely and intelligently designed by God. And then we are called the one creation that God made that is crafted in His image. And that our purpose is to know Him and reflect Him. And these are the boundaries. This is what is in bounds for God. That we would be in relationship with Him and that we would reflect who He is to each other and to God Himself. But as we saw in this previous era that really covered from creation to the fall, we saw that we're introduced to God, our Creator, but our corruption of His design. And this corruption of what God has designed has put us in a perilous condition with God. He designed us to know Him, to be able to be in relationship with Him, to walk with Him, to love Him, to worship Him, to glorify Him. And yet we despised His design and His purpose for us so that we would seek our own purpose. And so as we move out of era 1 from creation to the fall, we're going to move this morning into this really unknown time that's really from the fall to the flood. So after Adam and Eve's fall into sin and to the time of Noah, we're going to talk about this era in the Bible. And again, it's kind of this mysterious era. We're given some information, but it has a unique purpose. And so I want to talk about unique aspects of this era, share with you what I believe the significance of this era is and the overarching story of God's redemption. And then we're going to look at a central text that I believe within this era is going to be biblical truth for us and a challenge for each of us when we walk out together. So, era 2 is from fall to flood. This is after Adam and Eve have rejected God. They saw the fruit that was good for eating, but they disobeyed God. They took the fruit, they ate it, and God cursed them. He cursed the serpent which tempted them, and then he put a curse on humanity for their rebellion against him. We also get a glimpse of the kindness and the mercy of God, that he still gave them provision and care. So you had his judgment, but you also had his blessing or his care. Now, as we move forward into Scripture, we actually will pick up in Genesis 4. This section is Genesis 4 through Genesis 6:8 that we're really looking at. And the story continues after Adam and Eve, and there are two of their sons who are highlighted, Cain and Abel. We don't know how much time has been given between Adam and Eve and their removal from the Garden of Eden to this encounter with Cain and with Abel. Presumably, there could be a period of actually hundreds of years. We're not given their names. We do know that they are at least established in their fields, quite literally. I know, I'm sorry. That joke was a little out of bounds. Some of you were quick. Others of you are going, I missed it altogether. And I understand. So you have Abel presenting a sacrifice to the Lord, which is pleasing to the Lord. And then you have Cain presenting a sacrifice to the Lord that is in which is not pleasing at all. And Cain sees the blessing of God on his brother Abel, and he decides that he, out of a sense of vengeance, he's going to kill him. And he does. So we have the first murder that is recorded. And what this represents is it's a spiraling of corruption and a spreading of evil. It started with Adam and Eve, and now they're having children. And with these children who are born, there continues to be this deep brokenness and corruption that eventually will fill the earth. So after this interaction with Cain, you have God's judgment on Cain and a curse that's placed on him. And then you have the lineage of Cain. So that's you have Cain's corruption, but then also you have his lineage. And out of Cain's lineage, you're going to see that there's artisans, there's people of industry, but there's also people of great violence and wickedness. Basically, with Cain's lineage, you see humanity both good and bad. And then there's a statement about this other son who is born to Adam and Eve, and his name is Seth. And if you just want to look in the scriptures with me, you can see Genesis chapter 4, verse 26 is a hinge verse in this narrative. And it says, to Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So this is a hinge verse in this era where you have an example of deep corruption in Cain and what follows in his lineage, which is really a celebration of man and not allegiance and honor to God. But then you have the introduction of Seth, and through Seth's line, we have a picture of people begin calling on the name of the Lord. There is on the earth people who want to celebrate themselves and others who want to celebrate God. And so then you're going to get this lineage listed out of Seth's line, and that's found in Genesis chapter 5. Now, a key figure or a key repeated phrase in this is the phrase, and he died. And he died. This person was born to this person, and he died. This person was born to this person, and he... And what it reemphasizes is that there is a curse that has been placed on our rebellion, and that is we die. And they lived, and they had children, and they died. And they lived, and they had children, and then they died. And there are some figures in Seth's line that are amazing, wonderful figures of righteousness. One is Enoch. It says that he walked with God, and we have this sense that God took him, that he didn't even die, that God just brought him into his presence. And so then that brings us into, after we have the establishment of these lineages, things become so corrupt that God says it's time for me to bring judgment against this corruption that's happened amongst all humanity. And we're going to come into a passage in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 8 that is fraught with all kinds of weird or difficult to understand imagery. And I'm going to explain it all. Yeah, I heard that. Oh, boy. Yeah, that's right. There's still going to be a sense of mystery about what some of these things mean, but I'll try to be as clear as I can. But I want to answer the question first. What's significant about this era? In the era from fall to the flood, what is its significance? And that is our corruption results in God's judgment. Our corruption results in God's judgment. When the story began in the first era, we're introduced to God, our Creator, and our corruption of His design. In this era, we see that God responds to our sin, and that is a response of judgment. So if you are hoping to come to church and hear just a big dose of judgment, you picked a great Sunday to come and be here. What we're going to do is I'm going to read through the passage and then give you an outline of how we can understand it, and then begin making our way through this text that I believe will give us a call to walk in what God has originally designed. So we'll be in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Why don't you take your Bible and read along with me? It'll be on the screen. If you didn't come in today with a Bible and you'd like to have a physical copy, there are Bibles on the rows, and you can just say, hey, pass me one, and someone will get one to you. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. I'll read the whole passage, and then we'll walk through it. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, or Nephilim, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man from whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So this is going to be our central text in this era from fall to flood. Again, the significance is the corruption of humanity results in God's judgment. So how we can understand this passage is really in two sections. Verses 1 through 4 forms the first section, and then 5 through 8, the second. We have the corruption of humanity, and we have God's response, or the response of God. So we have the corruption of humanity and the response of God. The verse or the passage opens with this kind of temporal statement of in the time when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them. The sons of God, so that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Now, the first feature I want to point out here is that there is a repeated phrase so far in the first era and the second era, and it is what someone sees and then what they do after seeing that. So actually, when we have the created order by God, after God creates man in his own image, it says, and God saw, and it was very good. It was very good. But then when we go, and that's Genesis 1, verse 31, but when we go into Genesis chapter 3, we have Eve and Adam, it says, and when she saw that the fruit was good for eating, she took it and she ate it. Now we have, in a time when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. And instead of a response of seeing the beauty of God and the dignity of God on these women crafted in his image, they were possessions for the taking. So we have this pattern of something being seen and the response to it. For God, initially in creation, He saw people reflecting His image, and He said, this is very good. But then those who were made in His image, and in the corruption of their life, they saw things God had made and decided to make it something that they would take for themselves. We have an interpretation decision to make in this text because we need to decide, well, who are the sons of God? And there are three primary interpretations. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to just kind of walk through what the options are. Now, you've heard me talk about before, when we come to things in the Bible, there are things that are crystal clear as our doctrine, and we hold them with a closed fist. This is the truth. God created everything. Closed fist. Then we can have convictions which we hold in a grip, and then there are things that we hold with opinion or an open palm. In this section, this is more of an open hand issue. We'll talk about what is to be gripped or seized in this, but there are some that view the sons of God as fallen angels. These would be individuals who rebelled, or angels who rebelled against God and in judgment were cast to the earth along with Satan, and that they took on human form and intermarried in an inappropriate way with women. That actually is the oldest interpretation based off of a 2nd century Jewish work called First Enoch. The earliest of church fathers selected that as their interpretation, and so that will play into an understanding later in the passage about this mysterious group of powerful beings called the Nephilim. So that could be angels. And also we have examples of this phrase, sons of God, being ascribed to angels, and that's found in Job 1:6. So this phrase of being the Bar Elohim, the sons of God, is actually used of angels in other contexts. So it's a possibility. The second possibility is that these are rulers on the earth. These are people who have come into positions of power, and they held the authority, and they just abused their authority by taking whatever they saw. This certainly could be true, and this phrase of sons of God is also ascribed to people in powerful positions. You can see that in Psalm 82. But there's a third option, and it's Seth's lineage. And this is the one that I'm going to set forward as where I think this is what's going on, because what you have in the narrative of Genesis is you have the introduction of Adam and Eve, and they are supposed to be the perfect reflection of the character and the nature of God. It's what is supposed to be, yet they fall. And then you have the introduction of Cain, and it shows just the deterioration of the human condition. But then there's the introduction of this line, this lineage that belongs to Seth, where they were calling on the name of the Lord, and there are these righteous individuals that are found in his line. And the use of this phrase, the sons of God, is also ascribed to people who would be known as the children of God, like the Israelites. And so what we have is this expectation of, okay, we had Adam and Eve, they blew it. Oh man, Cain. But, okay, maybe there's some hope for humanity here. You have Seth's line. But if we ascribe the sons of God to mean Seth's line, what do we see? Those who had a history and a genealogy, perhaps of greater righteousness than the other side of the family. The sons of God, they saw the daughters of man. So they took them. So even the ones who were supposed to walk in righteousness, the ones who were supposed to have a heart for God, even they couldn't escape the corruption within themselves. You guys ever seen Seven Brides for Seven Brothers? This musical? It's really twisted. There's some things like Frozen is that way too. Like the movie Frozen, if you stop and just think about what all happens to these young girls in Frozen, it's like, that's really messed up. But with 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, there's these 7 brothers, they live up in the mountains and they all want wives. And so they know that there's a town down below, and so they're going to go and they're going to go get wives. And so they just go and they take them. And they abduct them and they take them for themselves. And then there's a great snow and the townspeople can't get to them. And over the course of winter, this really twisted musical becomes this beautiful love story. The women were sobbing, sobbing, sobbing. In a not so humorous way, we see where we can go. We see something good and we take it for ourselves. This wasn't just simply men seeing the beauty of women and following God's design of one man, one woman in a covenant relationship before God. It was men saying, I'll have her, and I'll have her, and I'll have her. And I will amass power and wealth and pleasure for myself. What we know about who these sons of God, we know this. They are godly men who corrupted God's design. That's what we know. They are godly men who corrupted God's design. It's the family that's the first to go. Do you see that in the story of God? He created husband and wife, and in the garden and their rebellion, that relationship gets fractured. And then you see the fracturing happening in the family. And even when you think that, okay, the story is making a better turn, even those who would be labeled, they are the sons of God, they are corrupt. And they take for themselves. So the passage continues in verse 3 and says, Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. So what you have God doing now is you have him saying, I cannot stand for this corruption, the abuse. And it's not just simply, I want to be clear on this, it's not just simply the fact that there were women who were being abused. It's that his image was being marred. He designed us to know him and to look like him. And he looked on his creation and he saw nothing that would reflect back to himself of his grace, his kindness, his mercy, his beauty. And the breath of life was not going to sustain man forever. He's mortal, he's flesh. And his days shall be 120 years. And a couple of positions on this of what does this mean, 120 years. Some would say it's 120 years from this pronouncement to when the flood would come. There are some who would see that. Others would say, no, this is the limitation of mankind is not going to be able to live beyond 120 years. What we do see is we see the trailing off of ages over time. Like as we go through the book of Genesis, you'll see that people begin to live shorter and shorter lives. So it may be that the limitation of man is not to exceed 120 years, or it may be that there's 120 years left until the flood is going to come and wipe man from the earth. The passage continues with the corruption of humanity. And it goes on in verse 4, it says, The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And so this is a very challenging verse also, and it's very curious to know, well, who are these people? They're mentioned again in the book of Numbers to describe when the spies went in to spy out the land of Canaan. They describe these giants that are in the likeness of the Nephilim. And these figures I think, while mysterious, I think the structure of the passage can help us. There's a technique, and we've talked about this before in the Bible, to know what the center point of a passage is. The writer will write in parallel. It's called a chiasm, okay, where there's a concept introduced, and then the concept is reinforced in a similar way later in the passage, and the pieces move together to a point in the middle. So when you look at this text and you see in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then if you jump down to verse 4, so you have this introduction of the spread of humanity and the taking of people for themselves. Then in verse 4, we have the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. So another statement of temporal history. In these days were these figures. It includes the daughters of man and the sons of God, and they were people of greatness. So these ideas are in parallel. Are you guys with me? So they're in parallel together, but the center, what you find kind of the Oreo cream filling between the cookie, is this statement that God says, my spirit will not abide in man forever. And there's a judgment that God is saying is coming. And that's the point. Humanity is corrupt, and this is where things are going. God won't stand for it. And this technique of studying the Bible helps us get to the main thing. The Nephilim, I believe, were the offspring of the mixed lines, the lines of Seth and lines of Cain. If you have a different position on that, just send me an email and we'll debate from there. But the point is that man's corruption had reached a point where God has said, enough. So verse 5, we move into his response. We see the corruption of humanity. It's continuing, it's spreading. And now there's a response of God. And verse 5 says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. If you were going to have a verse for this entire era of the story of God, this would be the verse. This says what the true human condition is before God, that in our sin, every intention of the thoughts of our hearts are only evil all the time. So we need to understand something about this concept of evil. Evil is man's corruption of God's holy will and name. Regardless of the degree of evil, humanity is unrighteous before God without any possibility of redemption unless God were to intervene. No one is righteous before God because we are all corrupted in our nature and our hearts. And Romans 1-3 provide the basis of this truth. The wicked, the moralist, and the religious all fall short of God's glory. There's an important doctrine for the church, and that is our universal need for a Savior. We are depraved. Welcome to Tombo Bible Church, y'all. Our nature and our hearts are turned against the beautiful design of God. We see what we want, so we take what we want. And that's in our hardwiring. Now, I believe that there are degrees of evil, but it speaks to the bottom line truth is that no one can claim righteousness before God. You see, there are people who are monsters. They seek to destroy life. They have given full sway to their passions and their lusts, and they hurt people. They hurt children. They divide homes. They steal, they rob, they kill, because they have just given full vent to the wickedness in their life. And there's a portion of our society that are monstrous. There is also a portion of our society who are very moral. They're moral people. They have aligned their lives as much as possible to a code that either they have created for themselves, their family, or their country, or their region. Maybe you've heard of a concept of Southern hospitality. You've heard about the idea of Southern hospitality. Well, that's because in the South, for some, there's a come on in, y'all culture. And we adapt to the culture in which we grew up in. And Romans talks about this. It talks about the Gentiles, that they live according to their code. The problem is, the moralist breaks their own code. Here's the standard, and they themselves can't even keep that standard. We have established boundaries in our culture, and then we cross them all the time. So there's morality that people pursue, but then there's also religion. So with morality, the code comes from the people themselves, whereas with religion, the code is defined either by the God that they want to follow or a set of rules or regulations. And they'll say, this is what's going to define my righteousness. But the problem with that is the same as the problem with the moralist. We cannot be righteous. Can we make positive contributions in our society as a moralist and as a religious person? Answer, yes. But what we cannot overcome is the true problem of evil, and that is evil puts us in an unrighteous place before God. And without His intervention, there's no way for us to overcome what we've done against His name and against His ways. That's why we have this incredible story, this overarching narrative of the redemption plan of God, to step in and do what we cannot do for ourselves. So verse 6 of chapter 6 says, "And the Lord was sorry that He had made man on the earth, and it grieved Him to His heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." What's revealed in this passage is an incredible truth about our God. God is not impassive. God is deeply engaged because He loves us. He's moved by what He sees in His people. We saw God seeing in Genesis 1, verse 31, God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. Now we have in Genesis chapter 6, the Lord saw. This time, He saw our wickedness, and it grieved Him. It says it grieved Him to His heart. This is not being sorry that you may have cut somebody off on the interstate. This is a deep-seated sorrow. And God felt it, knowing that it would result in, because of His justice and His holiness, it would result in His judgment. And so you have in this era God's judgment against the corruption of humanity. But I want you to notice verse 8. In the midst of this, the story of God is continuing because it says in verse 8, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." I'm thankful that the story of the Bible is God's story and not our own. And just as He brought judgment against Adam and Eve, He still provided covering for them. He still provided blessing for them and provision for them because He has a story to complete. And even in a time of severe judgment, God is preserving a plan that is pointing to a Redeemer who will come. So we have the corruption of humanity and we have the judgment of God, or the response of God to that. And what I think we see here is we see in this era God's boundaries. He has set an in-bounds line. Our family spends a lot of time on soccer fields, and there's an image that comes to mind. You'll see it in a little bit about things being in bounds or out of bounds. And what Genesis 1 provides us is it provides us what God said is in bounds. To know Him, to walk with Him, to reflect Him in our relationships, to represent Him rightly. And the boundaries that He has set, the first purpose is it reveals His name. When we look at creation and the vastness of it and all that God has made, we stop to consider the wonder of what God has put in motion. It reveals who He is. We're told in Scripture that the heavens declare the glory of God. Romans chapter 1 will say it is through what God has made. None of us have any excuse to deny that God is there. His boundaries reveal His name to us, and His boundaries reflect His image. You with me? Reveals His name and reflects His image. Our truth principle, though, is going out of bounds results in God's judgment. So if operating within His boundaries reveals His name and reflects His image, then to go outside of those boundaries, we should know and be aware that God cannot stand for that, and He will bring His judgment against our going out of bounds. So on this image on the screen, you can see an out-of-bounds line. Now, this is a special out-of-bounds line because this is at the corner at the end of the field. And so if the ball goes out to what's my left or goes out this direction, you throw the ball in. If the ball goes past at the bottom of the line, then it's a corner kick. And it provides an opportunity for a set play in soccer where the team the team that didn't kick it out of bounds has an opportunity to score. You should hear the passion that comes out of people about what they think is in bounds or out of bounds when something like this is online. You guys know what I'm talking about? How many of you have suffered at the soccer field? And there is something corrupt that rises out of me, and when I see this deep injustice of the wrong call, I'm quite loud. Projection is not my problem at the field. In fact, we had games this past week, and people let me know that they knew I was at the game. God has established boundary lines for our lives. Last week we talked about this call to honor His image and to consider the relationships and the work and the vocation entrusted to you, even if you're in that season called retirement, that there is a vocation entrusted to you that you are to honor God and to honor His image in that. Well, this message today is a challenge and a reminder to us to stay in bounds. Stay in bounds. I hope that this phrase stays with you this week, knowing that there is a purpose of God and a design of God for every relationship that you have, and you need to stay in bounds. When it comes to your use of time, when it comes to the things that you're going to put in front of your eyes, are you out of bounds? When it comes to the way that you speak to the people that are in your life. This past week, Did you stay in bounds? This is a reminder that if we stay in bounds, we will have the blessing and the pleasure of God over us. If we go out of bounds, then there will be correction that comes into our lives. It's His character. He must respond. He makes the call when we go out of bounds. Now, this could sound like an extremely moral message. Y'all just go be good people, stay inside the lines. But the truth is this is a spiritual command which demands a spiritual life, because in and of myself, I won't stay inside the lines. I will see and do whatever I see fit that works to my best interest. That's what I'm prone to do. That is what you are prone to do. This is a spiritual calling which demands spiritual life in order to carry this out. And spiritual life is found in the one who has become the righteousness of God for us. It's the passage that Trey read at the beginning of our service, that Jesus Christ became God's righteousness for us, that in Him we might become the righteousness of God. Stay in bounds. Could also be said, walk with Jesus. But I think the reminder for us today are the stakes, the character of God, of what He feels and what He does with our decision of staying in bounds.